Good evening. If you're here, you're probably ready to wind down. Turn off the noise of the modern world. And let your mind drift somewhere boring, repetitive, and slightly historical. So tuck yourself in, close your eyes, or don't, and let's step into the slow, dusty pages of medieval life, where even laughter could be a dangerous job. Tonight, we'll explore the strange and often disappointing career path of the medieval court jester. The one who was expected to make kings laugh, but could end up dead if he didn't. And that's just the beginning. We'll also meet other unfortunate folks through the centuries who didn't exactly land their dream jobs. Part 1: Why the jester's bells weren't so jolly. Most people think being a jester meant telling jokes in a funny hat. But really, it meant being constantly afraid of misjudging a king's mood. The court jester wasn't just comic relief. He had to be clever, quick, and politically aware, because the wrong joke could be considered treason. Sometimes the jester was the only one allowed to criticize the king, but that permission was a fragile thing. Jesters were often chosen not for humor, but for deformities, odd behavior, or tragic backstories that amused the elite. Some weren't even paid, just fed and kept around like exotic pets. And no, the hat didn't help. The bells were loud, the shoes pinched, and the job security? Non-existent. If the king got bored, the jester could be replaced by a dancing bear. Part 2: When jokes turned deadly. Not every king had a sense of humor. One misplaced joke could turn a festive evening into a fatal one. In many cases, the king didn't need a good reason to become angry. And when a jester made a mistake, he didn't just lose his job, he might lose his head. To survive, the jester had to be deeply informed about everything happening in the royal court. Who had recently been demoted? Who had fallen out of favor? Who the queen secretly admired? One careless remark about the wrong person at the wrong time could land the funny man in the cold, damp dungeon, or worse, banished from the kingdom entirely. Some jesters tried to avoid verbal blunders by turning to physical comedy, juggling knives, dancing on ropes, or reciting clever fables. But even that wasn't foolproof. Sometimes, if the king woke up on the wrong side of the bed, the most carefully rehearsed performance could still be seen as offensive. Part 3: The jester's privileges were not what they seemed. To outsiders, it might have looked like the jester had a privileged position. After all, he could speak directly to the king, tease nobles, and move freely through the castle. But those so-called privileges came with heavy strings attached. The jester was not a trusted advisor. He was a spectacle, a distraction, a walking, jingling buffer between the crown and its endless problems. And if he ever forgot his role for a moment, if he spoke too seriously, or refused to perform, he could be beaten, imprisoned, or simply dismissed without notice. Worse still, his freedom of speech was not legally protected. It was tolerated only so long as it entertained. The moment the jester's words made someone uncomfortable, whether it was a baron, a bishop, or the king himself, he could find himself gagged, thrown into a rat-infested cell, or forced to perform humiliating penance in public. There were even jesters who were blind or physically disabled, kept around because their appearance made nobles feel superior. In such cases, the jester's suffering wasn't a side effect, it was part of the show. Part 4: When the laughter died down. Evenings in the Great Hall could be long. After hours of feasting, drinking, and political maneuvering, the jester was expected to perform, again and again, until the nobles were either satisfied or unconscious. But as the night dragged on, the mood often shifted. Laughter turned to lethargy, amusement gave way to scrutiny, and the jester, exhausted from hours of juggling, mimicking, and storytelling, still had to keep the court entertained. This was the most dangerous time of all. If he slipped, mumbled, or stumbled, someone might accuse him of mocking a noble's limp or insulting a bishop's weight. A harmless rhyme could be mistaken for a political jab, and if the king's mood soured, the jester's fate could be sealed before sunrise. He wasn't allowed to show fatigue. He couldn't leave until dismissed. And sometimes, the nobles kept him on his feet just to see how long he could last. It wasn't comedy. It was survival wrapped in bells and patchwork fabric. Part 5: The jester slept near the rats, not the royals. While nobles retired to warm feather beds draped in furs and tapestries, the jester often slept in the coldest parts of the castle, or not in the castle at all. Despite spending his days entertaining royalty, he was not considered one of them. His quarters were typically near the kitchens, the stables, or even the dungeon steps. The stone floors were damp. The air was thick with smoke or mildew, and the only heat came from whatever straw or ragged blanket he could scavenge. If he was lucky, he had a corner to himself. If not, he shared space with servants, rodents, or wandering cats. There was no nighttime comfort for the jester. No candlelight reading, no down pillows, just the echoes of laughter that faded into the dark, leaving behind a man in a jester's hat, curled beside a wall, trying not to shiver. And yet, he had to rise with the dawn, ready to smile again, to make others forget how grim the world really was, even if he never could. Part 6. The jester ate last, and often least. A grand feast in the castle might have included roasted boar, honey-glazed fruits, and loaves of steaming bread, but the jester rarely saw those delights on his plate. He wasn't a guest, he was the entertainment. And once his performance ended, the scraps were all that remained. Servants would pile leftovers into wooden bowls, not bones. Stale crusts, bits of gristle, and that's what the jester would eat. If the court was in a generous mood, he might get a slice of meat or a cup of watered wine. If not, he went to bed hungry. Even when jesters were invited to the table for show, they were expected to keep joking throughout the meal. They couldn't eat comfortably. They couldn't relax. A mouthful of food could be interrupted by a demand. Tell us a tale. Fool. And if the joke fell flat, dinner could end early, with him being thrown out. While others dined in warmth and luxury, the jester's mealtime was a quiet reminder. He was never truly part of the court. He existed on the edges, visible, but never included. Part 7. Mocked by the masses. Not just the monarchs. While the jester performed for nobles, he was rarely respected by anyone. To the royal court, he was a disposable tool for amusement. To the servants, he was a curiosity, someone who seemed privileged but had no real power. And to the commoners, he was little more than a royal pet. When jesters walked through village streets or market stalls, they were often met with mockery themselves. Children laughed at their strange clothes. Merchants eyed them with suspicion. Some even threw scraps or shouted slurs, treating the jester like a living joke long after the performance ended. He wasn't feared like a knight, revered like a monk, or admired like a minstrel. He was a target, easy to ridicule, hard to understand, and often too proud to protest. This was the bitter truth. The jester brought laughter to others, but lived with a quiet loneliness. He was surrounded by people, yet seen by none. His bells rang in crowded halls, but echoed like hollow reminders that even humor had its place, and his was always beneath everyone else. Part 8. No family, no future, no fame. Unlike knights who earned titles, or scribes who passed on knowledge, jesters had no real legacy. They didn't build wealth. They didn't own land. They rarely had families. Their names were forgotten even faster than their jokes. Most jesters never married. Few would want to build a life with someone who spent their days at court pretending to be happy and their nights sleeping near the stables. And even if a jester did have a spouse or child, the job offered no stability, only ridicule and risk. There were no retirement plans for fools, no pensions, no peaceful endings. When a jester became too old to dance, too hoarse to sing, or too slow to dodge an insult, he was cast aside. Some wandered town to town, performing in muddy squares. Others simply disappeared, fading into the shadows of history, one forgotten giggle at a time. In the end, the jester's life was not about legacy. It was about enduring each day, one smile at a time, until the laughter stopped, and no one noticed. Part 9. The jester was always on call. Unlike other roles in the castle that followed routines, like the cook with his meal schedule or the guard with his watch shifts, the jester had no set hours. He was expected to be available whenever the court grew bored, no matter the time. A sudden knock on the jester's door in the dead of night wasn't unusual. If a noble couldn't sleep or wanted to amuse a guest, the jester had to be roused from his straw bed, rub the sleep from his eyes, and immediately become funny. There were no excuses, no postponements, just bells, bows, and performance on demand. He couldn't say no. He couldn't ask for rest. To refuse would be seen as insubordination, or worse, as disrespect. His energy was not his own. His moods didn't matter. He was expected to smile, laugh, bow, and dance regardless of hunger, cold, or exhaustion. And when everyone else had gone back to sleep, the jester returned to his corner, drained, unheard, and invisible. Part 10. Laughter was a dangerous weapon. The jester's only tool was laughter, but it was a double-edged sword. Used wisely, it could diffuse tension, entertain the court, or cleverly criticize someone too powerful to confront directly. But used poorly, it could spark outrage, humiliation, and even violence. If a jester made a noble the butt of a joke, that noble might smile on the outside, but plot revenge in private. More than one jester had found himself mysteriously injured after a particularly sharp quip. Some were exiled, others disappeared altogether. Even the king's own mood was unpredictable. What amused him one day might insult him the next. A harmless pun could be seen as sedition. A parody might be interpreted as prophecy. In an age when whispers were feared as much as weapons, jesters lived on the knife's edge of acceptability. To survive, a jester had to master the art of veiled meaning, clever enough to entertain, but vague enough to deny. He had to speak in riddles, rhyme in code, and smile while wondering if this joke might be his last. Part 11. The costume wasn't optional. The jester's outfit, bright colors, bells, mismatched patterns, floppy hat, wasn't something he wore by choice. It was a uniform, a visual signal of his place in the world, always amusing, never serious, and never allowed to blend in. Even when the jester wasn't performing, he was expected to wear it. Walking through the castle grounds, bells jingling, visiting the kitchen for bread, bright yellow sleeves catching every eye. The costume marked him as different, separate, and entirely ornamental. The bells weren't just noisy, they were humiliating. They ensured everyone heard him coming. He couldn't sneak away, couldn't quietly rest, couldn't ever just be. His very presence was a performance, even when he said nothing at all. Some jesters had to wear exaggerated shoes, padded stomachs, or even fake humps to appear more foolish. The more absurd he looked, the more he was tolerated. Not because people liked him, but because they could laugh without thinking. And deep down, he knew, if he ever took off the costume, no one would see him at all. Part 12. No one took the jester seriously, even when they should have. The jester often saw more than people realized. He listened while he served, observed while he entertained, and understood the moods of nobles, knights, and clergy better than many advisors. He knew when a lord was scheming. He could spot the nervous shuffle of a guilty baron. He could hear the tension behind the laughter. But no one listened to the jester's warnings. If he ever tried to speak seriously, perhaps to point out a brewing conflict or a dishonest noble, he was brushed aside, laughed off, or mocked. Oh, listen to the fool try to be wise, they'd say. It was one of the jester's deepest frustrations, knowing more than he could ever say, and being ignored even when he tried. His insight was filtered through comedy, his truth diluted in rhyme. If he wanted to speak plainly, no one would hear him, so he kept silent, or worse, he wrapped his warnings in jokes and watched as they flew over the heads of those he tried to protect. The jester saw everything, but remained invisible. Part 13. He was everyone's entertainment, but no one's friend. The jester was always surrounded by people, but rarely included. He sat in the great hall but not at the table of honor. He made everyone laugh but shared in none of their joy. He was spoken to, but never truly spoken with. Nobles would pat his shoulder or chuckle at his jabs. But when the wine ran out and the fire dimmed, no one asked how he was doing. No one invited him to walk in the garden, or offered him a seat beside the hearth. He was welcome on the stage, and forgotten off it. Servants avoided him too, unsure whether he was one of them or something else entirely. He lived between worlds, not noble, not common, just strange, an oddity, a shadow with a smile. At night, when the laughter faded, the jester returned to a silence heavier than stone. He had no confidants, no allies, just echoes of applause, and the knowledge that his role was to amuse others, while his own soul remained untouched, unheard, and unseen. Part 14. When the court turned ugly, the jester was first to blame. Royal courts were not peaceful places. Beneath the silks and songs were whispers of betrayal, alliances shifting like sand, and tempers as volatile as the fires that warmed the halls. And when something went wrong, a poor harvest, a diplomatic insult, or even a spilled goblet, the jester was a convenient scapegoat. He was always there, after all, always speaking, always moving, always visible. If a noble felt embarrassed, they might claim the jester had insulted them. If a visiting dignitary grew offended, the king could blame the fool's unruly mouth. Sometimes, the court needed someone to punish publicly, someone whose suffering could reset the tone of the hall. The jester's punishments ranged from public flogging to being banished in disgrace. No defense helped, no record was kept, his title gave him no shield. In fact, his role invited blame. He was not just entertainment, he was a pressure valve. When the court boiled over, the fool was the one tossed into the fire. Part 15. His pain was part of the performance. The jester's job wasn't just to be funny, it was to be foolish, awkward, clumsy, and sometimes, to be humiliated on purpose. A pratfall that left him bruised? Hilarious. A joke that turned on himself? Even better. A noble tossing wine in his face? That could bring the loudest laughs of all. The court delighted in watching him slip, stumble, and recover. His physical discomfort was not just tolerated, it was expected. Pain was comedy. Embarrassment was a punchline. And he learned to smile through it. To turn a twisted ankle into a dance. To make a broken tooth part of the act. Even when his ribs ached or his knees gave out, he bowed and rang his bells, because if he didn't, someone else might replace him who would. No one asked if he was okay. That wasn't the point. He existed to absorb discomfort. To become the living joke that made everyone else feel a little more powerful. Even in pain, the jester had to laugh. Part 16. He was never allowed to grow old gracefully. Growing old in medieval times was already difficult. But for a jester, it was particularly cruel. His entire identity, his worth to the court, was tied to energy, flexibility, quick wit, and physical agility. As the years passed, all of that faded. His jumps became slower, his voice raspier, his memory less sharp, and the audience noticed. Their laughter turned to sighs. Their cheers turned to silence. Then, eventually, to whispers. Perhaps it's time for a younger fool. There was no pension, no honorific title, no farewell feast. A jester who grew too old simply vanished from the schedule. One day, he wasn't summoned, then he wasn't fed, then he wasn't mentioned at all. Some left quietly, drifting into nearby villages to beg or perform for coins. Others stayed, lingering in the back halls of the castle like ghosts in motley. Ignored by those who once cheered for them. The jester had given his youth to the crown, but the crown had nothing to give in return once that youth ran out. Part 17. He was forbidden from showing real emotion. The jester was allowed to laugh, but not to cry. He could act silly, sarcastic, or sharp, but never sincere. Real feelings, especially sadness, were off limits. After all, who wanted a gloomy fool? If his heart was heavy, he had to bury it. If he lost a friend, he had to joke through it. If he was ill, he had to perform with a grin. Tears were not part of the act. They made people uncomfortable. They ruined the illusion. Even in moments of personal grief, a family member's death, a betrayal, or sickness, the jester was expected to keep spirits high. His sorrow had no place in the echoing halls of nobility. It was unprofessional, inappropriate, and so, he became a master of masks. Every expression was rehearsed, every smile carefully placed. His real self was hidden behind layers of performance. Until even he forgot what it felt like to be genuine. Behind the makeup and the bells was a man who was never truly allowed to be himself. Part 18. His knowledge was always undervalued. The jester wasn't always a fool. In fact, many jesters were incredibly intelligent. They knew poetry, music, philosophy, and politics. Some could speak multiple languages, play instruments, recite classic texts, or mimic the speech patterns of nobles with uncanny accuracy. But none of that earned them respect. If a jester made a clever observation, it was brushed off as a joke. If he referenced ancient texts, it was met with laughter, not admiration. His intellect was hidden behind the jingling hat and the funny voices. People didn't see him as wise, they saw him as ridiculous. Worse still, if he did show how much he knew, he risked offending the powerful. A too smart fool was dangerous. A jester who understood court politics better than the courtiers made people nervous. And nervous nobles could be cruel. So he kept his knowledge to himself, wrapped it in riddles, disguised it as nonsense, because in his world, Being smart only mattered if no one realized you were. Part 19. The Jester couldn't even choose his own name. In many courts, the Jester didn't get to keep his real name. Instead, he was given a nickname, usually something ridiculous, mocking, or demeaning. Pickle, fartle, nod, bumble. Names that sounded funny when shouted across a crowded hall, but stripped the man of his identity. The name became part of the act. It was written in court records, used in psalm lyrics, and even spoken in diplomatic company. And no matter how much the Jester hated it, he had no say in changing it. His old name, the one his parents gave him, faded from memory. Both his and everyone else's. It was one more layer of invisibility. One more reminder that he was a character. Not a person, a walking joke, even down to the syllables others used to call him. And when he finally left the court, or was thrown out, people wouldn't even remember who he had been before the bells. The jokes, and the name that was never truly his. Part 20. Even in death, he wasn't taken seriously. When nobles died, they were buried with ceremony, incense, velvet-lined coffins, and mourners reading solemn verses. But when a Jester died, it was often without fanfare, without eulogy, and sometimes without even a marked grave. The court simply moved on. If he had served well, there might be a brief toast to the fool, he made us laugh. But no one recited his deeds. No one recorded his history. His costume might be passed to another. His name, whatever it was, quickly forgotten. Some Jesters were buried behind the castle walls, in servants' plots, or even outside church grounds. Seen as too irreverent for holy soil. A man who spent his life lightening hearts was cast away as if he never mattered at all. His legacy lived only in echoes, in stories that others twisted, or in jokes that survived without credit. The laughter remained, but the man behind it vanished into silence. And perhaps that, more than anything, is why it truly sucked to be a medieval court jester. Part 21. The fool was not free to leave. Most workers in the medieval court could leave their positions, eventually. A knight could retire to his land. A maid could return to her village. A cook might marry and open a bakery. But for the Jester, departure wasn't that simple. Once a Jester became part of the court, he was considered property in all but name. He was tied to the monarch's amusement. Leaving would mean abandoning one's duty, and that could be viewed as betrayal or defiance. Some Jesters tried to escape, only to be hunted down and dragged back. Others were refused permission to travel. Even those who managed to leave often found their reputations followed them. No one wanted to hire a man who had mocked kings for a living. He was both visible and trapped, allowed to walk the halls, but never truly free. His bells were not chains, but they served the same purpose, to remind him, and everyone else, that he belonged to someone else's entertainment. Even freedom, for the fool, was just another joke he wasn't allowed to tell. Part 22. He was surrounded by secrets, but trusted by no one. The Jester heard everything. Whispers behind tapestries, confessions over wine, gossip traded in corners when nobles thought no one was listening. He knew who was plotting, who was jealous, and who had quietly vanished. But no one confided in the Jester. They spoke in front of him as if he were furniture. Or worse, a mirror that never reflected back. He was expected to know nothing, remember nothing, and say nothing, unless it was wrapped in humor. And if he ever did repeat what he heard, even by accident, punishment was swift. He was blamed for stirring trouble, accused of slander, treated like a spy, so he kept it all inside. Carried a mind full of dangerous knowledge, with no outlet and no allies. The things he knew could change lives, or end them. But he said nothing, because saying something might end his. In a castle full of secrets, the Jester held the most, and no one ever thanked him for it. Part 23. He was expected to cheer up a broken world. No matter how grim the times, plague, famine, war, the Jester was expected to make people laugh, while others mourned their families, fled from danger, or prayed for salvation. The Jester's job remained the same: bring smiles to weary faces. It didn't matter that he was scared too, that he had lost people, that he was hungry, tired, or grieving. His feelings were irrelevant. His purpose was singular: lift the mood. During sieges, when food ran out and the castle grew silent with fear, the Jester would be summoned. Tell us something funny, they'd say, while the walls shook with distant cannon fire. When illness swept through the court and bodies were carried out daily, the jester still performed, forced to turn terror into distraction. His laughter echoed in the halls not because times were joyful, but because people needed to forget. But who cheered up the jester? No one. Part 24. He had to entertain people who despised him. Not everyone who laughed at the jester liked him. In fact, many nobles looked down on him with open contempt. To them, he was lower than a servant, more of a pet than a person. His jokes were enjoyed, but his presence was not respected. Some lords sneered as he performed. Others mocked him after he left the room. A few delighted in insulting him to his face, using cruel nicknames or daring him to humiliate himself further just for their amusement. And through it all, the jester had to smile. He had to bow, play along, and act as if the insults were part of the show. To respond with anger would be unthinkable. To defend himself would be dangerous. So he laughed with them. Not because it was funny, but because it was safer. Every jest he made was aimed at those who had the power to crush him. Every performance was a careful dance around egos sharper than swords. The applause wasn't admiration. It was permission to continue being humiliated, for their entertainment. Part 25. His stories were stolen and never credited. The jester was a storyteller at heart. He crafted jokes, spun fables, and turned rumors into clever rhymes. Many of the tales he told were his own creations, twisted from observation, sharpened with wit, and delivered with perfect timing. But in the royal court, ideas didn't belong to the one who spoke them. They belonged to whoever had the power to repeat them. A noble might retell a jester's line at a banquet and earn praise. A prince could steal one of his parables and call it a proverb. Even minstrels would carry his tales into other towns, never once mentioning the man in motley who first spoke the words. And the jester? He stayed silent. If he protested, it would sound petty. If he demanded credit, it would sound absurd. He was not a recognized author. He was not a respected poet. He was just the jester. But night after night, people laughed at stories that weren't his anymore. The words lived on, but the voice behind them vanished into the shadows. Part 26. He was trapped between all classes, and belonged to none. The jester moved freely through the court. He could speak to kings, tease knights, and whisper jokes to scullery maids. But that freedom was an illusion, because no one truly accepted him. The nobility saw him as a servant. The servants saw him as something else, closer to the rulers. But not quite one of them. And the common folk saw him as strange, tainted by palace life, and out of touch with their struggles. He had no peers, no equals, no true community. If he laughed with the nobles, he was called arrogant. If he sympathized with the poor, he was mocked for pretending to care. Wherever he went, he was slightly too much of something, or not enough of something else. So he lived between worlds, belonging nowhere, trusted by none, smiling at everyone, a man without a tribe, a voice without a home, a soul always performing. Part 27. He was expected to make fun of himself first. Before the jester could joke about anyone else in the court, he had to make himself the first target. It was a rule that wasn't written, but always enforced. Laugh at yourself before you laugh at others. So he exaggerated his clumsiness. He made fun of his clothes, his face, his own poverty. He played up his flaws so the nobles would feel safe, so they'd know the fool didn't take himself too seriously. It was a strategy, but it wore him down. Every performance began with a small public humiliation, a reminder that he was there to be laughed at, not just with. He had to strip himself of dignity so others wouldn't feel threatened. And over time, it became less of an act, and more of a habit. He told the same self-deprecating jokes so many times that even he started to believe them. Not because they were true, but because it was easier than pretending he was more than the part he played. In the court, a jester's safety came from his ability to belittle himself, until there was almost nothing left. Part 28. He was often the only one without armor. Everyone in the court had some form of protection. The knights had chainmail. The nobles had status. The clergy had divine authority. Even servants had each other, a quiet solidarity in shared labor. But the jester stood alone, unarmed and unguarded. He wore no armor, literal or symbolic. His weapon was wit, but that couldn't stop a fist. His defense was charm, but that couldn't block a fall. If someone lashed out, physically or politically, he had no one to shield him. There were jesters who were beaten for a joke misunderstood. Some were struck in drunken rage by nobles who claimed it was just sport. Others were thrown from rooms, knocked downstairs, or worse, and there was no justice for them. No trial, no apology. He wasn't important enough to defend, and he certainly wasn't dangerous enough to fear. So he learned to dodge, to flinch early, to smile quickly, to make himself small in moments of threat. The jester was never meant to fight. He was meant to absorb insults, punches, mockery, and turn them into laughter, even if it hurt. Part 29. He was always watched, but rarely seen. In the medieval court, the jester lived under constant observation. Eyes followed him everywhere, waiting for the next joke, the next stumble, the next amusing outburst. He was expected to perform not just on stage, but in every hallway, meal, and passing glance. But for all that attention, no one truly saw him. They saw the costume, the capers, the exaggerated grin, but not the person beneath. They didn't notice the tired eyes, the forced laughter, the still moments when the mask briefly slipped. They didn't ask who he was before the bells, before the roll. It was a strange kind of invisibility, to be watched constantly, but never recognized as fully human, to be spoken to, but never heard, to be remembered for a joke, but forgotten the moment the laughter ended. The jester lived in plain sight, bright and loud, but carried a loneliness deeper than the castle moat. Because being seen isn't the same as being known. Part 30. The role was a cage disguised as freedom. To the casual observer, the jester seemed free. He could go places others couldn't, say things others wouldn't dare. He could dance through the throne room, poke fun at authority, even interrupt the king with a joke. But that freedom was carefully constructed and tightly confined. The jester could joke, but only if it made the right people laugh. He could speak, but only if it was harmless. He could act outrageous, but only within the unspoken boundaries of entertainment. The moment he stepped outside that narrow space, when the joke cut too deep, or the truth hit too close, he was reminded of exactly where he stood. His freedom wasn't real. It was part of the act, a tool used by those in power to give the illusion of tolerance while keeping him tightly controlled. And he knew it. With every step, every word, every smile, the jester understood. He was free in the same way a bird is free inside a gilded cage, bright, beautiful, and forever trapped. Part 31. He was the first to be blamed in bad weather. Superstition ran deep in the medieval world. If the harvest failed, it was the gods. If a cow gave sour milk, it was a curse. And if a storm ruined the feast or lightning struck near the castle, well, somehow, it was the jester's fault. He was a convenient symbol. Loud, visible, unusual. To many, he was already unsettling with his painted face and peculiar behavior. So when misfortune arrived, people searched for someone odd to blame, and the jester fit the part. Some thought his jokes angered heaven. Others claimed he drew bad luck by mocking holy men or noble rituals. A few simply said he had a cursed aura, because the world felt easier to explain if someone was at fault. It didn't matter how absurd the accusation. If the wind howled too loud or the river flooded the village, someone might mutter, "It's that fool's doing." He wasn't just the scapegoat for royal embarrassment, he became the scapegoat for the sky itself. Part 32. He was never allowed to be still. Stillness was seen as laziness in the jester. If he sat quietly in a corner, someone would call out, "Fool, why so gloomy?" If he paused and thought, a noble might snap, "Do something funny." If he rested even for a moment, eyes turned suspicious. After all, what good was a silent jester? Unlike others in the court, who could reflect, mourn, or pray, the jester was expected to be in motion, always clapping, skipping, reciting, or juggling. Stillness broke the illusion. Stillness reminded people that he was human. So he danced when he was tired. He joked when he wanted to sleep. He performed even when his limbs ached and his voice cracked. Because if he ever stopped moving, people stopped caring, or worse, started noticing the man beneath the mask. In a world that feared silence, the jester was a living distraction, and he carried that burden in every tired step. Part 33. He was sometimes forced to be the messenger of bad news. In royal courts, no one wanted to deliver bad news, telling the king that his army had lost, or that a rival lord had insulted him, or even that the wine had gone sour. These tasks were dangerous. Messengers could be punished simply for bearing the truth. So sometimes, they gave the task to the jester. The idea was simple. If bad news came with a joke, perhaps it would sting less. If it was wrapped in rhyme or delivered with a silly dance, maybe the king would laugh before he got angry. Maybe, but often, it didn't work. The jester, forced to smile through grim tidings, became the focus of the king's fury. After all, he was the one speaking the words. It didn't matter if he wrote them, he spoke them. And so the throne heard his voice. Many jesters learned to dread these moments more than any performance. Delivering bad news with a forced grin, not knowing if the audience would laugh or reach for a sword. Part 34. He couldn't mourn publicly, even in times of grief. When someone in the court died, a noble, a knight, even another servant, there were days of mourning. Black cloths were hung, bells were tolled, and the halls fell silent in respect. Except for the jester. He was still expected to perform. Even as others wore solemn faces, he had to smile. While priests chanted prayers, he was told to keep the mood from sinking too low. If he seemed too quiet, too reflective, he might be accused of disrespecting the grieving process, or worse, trying to draw attention to himself. But jesters grieved too. They lost friends. They lost mentors. Sometimes, they lost family members outside the castle walls. And no one even noticed. And still, they were made to wear their bells and colors, to bounce and rhyme while their hearts felt heavy. He wasn't allowed black robes. No moment of silence. No break from his role. Because the court believed a jester was there to lift spirits, even when his own had fallen beyond reach. Part 35. He was replaced without a word. In the end, no matter how many years the jester served, how many laughs he inspired, or how many royal tantrums he softened, his departure was never grand. There was no ceremony, no carved plaque, no songs sung in his name. He simply vanished. One day, a new jester would appear in the court. Younger, louder, dressed in brighter colors. The nobles would chuckle, the king would nod, and the court would move on. No one asked what happened to the old fool. No one checked his room. No one said goodbye. Perhaps he had grown too slow. Perhaps he had fallen ill. Perhaps he had finally collapsed from years of laughter, forced labor. But it didn't matter. In a world that demanded constant entertainment, the person behind the performance was never the point. He had played his part. The bells had rung, and when they stopped, the silence was not mourned, it was simply filled by someone else. Part 36. Even his laughter wasn't truly his. The jester laughed all the time, loud, shrill, exaggerated laughter that filled the echoing halls. But very little of it came from real joy. It was practiced, rehearsed, a sound crafted to please others. He laughed when the king made a joke, even if it wasn't funny. He laughed when nobles insulted him, because they expected it. He laughed at his own misfortunes before others could, turning every stumble into a punchline. And over time, the line between real and forced laughter blurred. Sometimes he laughed automatically, even when alone, even when sad. The sound came out of him like a reflex, like a habit that had become his only armor. But the truth was, the jester rarely felt joy. His laughter was a costume of sound, just like his patched coat was a costume of color. A mask meant to keep others comfortable. He gave laughter freely, but kept none for himself. Because the one thing the world demanded from him was the one thing he was never truly allowed to feel. Part 37. He couldn't pray like everyone else. In the medieval world, faith was everywhere. Monks prayed in candlelit chapels. Knights knelt before battle. Even peasants whispered to saints in the fields. But the jester? He was expected to remain a fool, even before God. If he bowed his head in chapel, someone might say, "Is the fool begging forgiveness for his jokes?" If he joined a prayer, nobles might chuckle. What could he possibly be thankful for? And if he appeared solemn, they assumed it was part of his act. He was mocked even in sacred spaces. Some jesters were barred from entering churches altogether, especially if their routines had ever poked fun at bishops or holy relics. Others were allowed in, but only to amuse the congregation during festivals, never to participate sincerely. So he prayed in silence, alone, at night, in corners, not for riches or favor, just for peace, just to be heard, just to feel, for one moment, like more than a joke. But even then, he wondered if heaven was laughing too. Part 38. He was trained to be forgettable. The jester was taught to make others memorable. He framed the king's cleverness with well-timed laughter. He made nobles shine by playing the fool beside them. His stories gave other people glory, while he stayed in the shadows between the lines. In fact, the better he was at his job, the more invisible he became. He knew just when to step back, when to vanish from the room before his presence became tiring. He knew how to deliver the perfect joke and immediately fade, leaving others to soak up the applause. His skill was in being forgotten. He was in paintings only as a blurry figure in the corner. In stories, he was the fool without a name. In memories, he was a sound, a laugh, a bell, a whisper, not a man. And so, over time, even he forgot himself. Not because he was unimportant, but because the role demanded he disappear, so others could feel more alive. Part 39. His only legacy was the laughter of others. The knights left behind swords and statues. The lords were buried beneath stone markers with coats of arms. Even the scribes had their inked pages to outlive them. But the jester? He left behind nothing. No scrolls bore his name. No ballads sang of his deeds. No stained glass windows depicted his face. What he gave the world, laughter, was as fleeting as breath. And just as easily forgotten. There were no heirs to carry on his trade. No guild of fools. No school for jesters to preserve his craft. Everything he knew, the timing, the tone, the tricks, died with him. And yet, in some small way, he lived on. In the way a village told a joke, an old fool used to say. In the half-remembered rhyme of a traveling bard. In a dusty corner of memory. Where joy once flickered, brief and bright. It wasn't much, but for a man who had no titles, no lands, and no tomb, it was all he could leave behind. A laugh, a moment, a trace of something lighter. Part 40. The bells he wore were louder than his voice. The jester's costume was never silent. Bells sewn into his hat, shoes, and sleeves jingled with every movement, designed to make him noticed. To signal his presence like a walking chime. But while the bells rang clear, his true voice was rarely heard. He could be in a room without saying a word, and people would still laugh at the sound of his arrival. The memory of past antics, or simply the absurdity of his appearance. And when he did speak, earnestly, honestly, it was often drowned out by those very bells. No one expected wisdom from a jester. No one waited for a serious thought. His words were judged before they were spoken, wrapped in the sound of comedy before they ever had a chance to land. So, over time, he spoke less, not in performance, but in life. Because the world had made it clear, it wanted his noise. Not his meaning, his echoes, not his truth. And as the bells rang with each step, they whispered something only he could hear. Be funny, be loud, but never be real. Part 41. His body aged, but his role didn't. The court never adjusted its expectations. Whether the jester was 20 or 60, he was still expected to tumble, dance, jump, and jest like he had when he first donned the bells. His joints ached, his steps slowed, his breath came shorter with each routine. But the crowd didn't notice, or didn't care. He was the fool, eternal, ageless. The role didn't come with seasons or stages. It came with demands. No one expected the jester to grow old. And when he did, it was seen as a kind of failure, like a cracked mask or a faded painting. Some jesters tried to adapt, telling stories instead of performing tricks, using wordplay in place of pratfalls. But if the laughter dipped, they were replaced. Because the court didn't want evolution, they wanted nostalgia. The jester they remembered, the fool they always expected. So he smiled through creaking knees and fading sight. He stayed in motion even when his body begged him to stop. Because slowing down meant they'd finally see the truth. The jester was mortal too. Part 42. He couldn't choose silence. Silence was a luxury in the medieval court, and it was one the jester was never allowed. Even in moments of tension, when others wisely held their tongues, the jester was expected to speak. A grim dinner? He was to lighten it. A heated argument? He was to cut through it. A grieving monarch? He was to somehow lift the weight of sorrow with a clever line. But what if he had nothing to say? He wasn't allowed to wait until the right words came. His silence would be noticed, questioned, and possibly punished. What's wrong with the fool? They'd ask. Has he run out of wit? So he filled the quiet with nonsense, with rhyme, with exaggerated sighs and jokes made of air. He became a noise machine, trained to never leave a space unfilled. Because silence meant discomfort, and discomfort, in the court, had to be silenced, with him. There were nights he longed to simply sit, to watch the fire burn and let the moment pass without a word. But in the castle, silence from a fool was more frightening than any joke. Part 43. He was punished for saying what others whispered. The jester's strange privilege was that he could say things others could not, mock the bishop, mimic the queen, poke fun at the prince's poor aim with a bow. Everyone laughed, until they didn't. He walked a tightrope, balancing between amusement and offense. And when the court grew tense, when politics twisted too tightly or tempers boiled too high, the jester's harmless jokes suddenly became dangerous. Nobles who once chuckled now scowled. A jest made in jest was suddenly, deeply inappropriate. The same words spoken yesterday were now, unacceptable slander. And no one came to his defense. It didn't matter that the courtiers had whispered worse things behind closed doors. They hadn't said them in public. They hadn't wrapped them in rhyme. They hadn't worn bells on their sleeves. The jester said what others thought, and paid the price for it. Because in the end, the fool was always the most convenient person to blame, especially for truths that hit too close to home. Part 44. His humor wasn't always his own. Not all jokes the jester told came from him. Sometimes, powerful nobles would whisper punchlines in his ear before the feast. Say this about Lord Edwin. They'd insist. Make it seem like it came from you. If the jester refused, he risked offending someone too important. If he obeyed, he might insult someone else even more dangerous. And worst of all, when the joke landed poorly, the noble who fed it to him would vanish into the crowd, leaving the fool alone to face the consequences. He was a puppet in a web of quiet cruelty, used to deliver barbed messages disguised as wit, mocking the weak to flatter the powerful, mocking the powerful to serve the ambitions of their rivals. And if things turned sour, the court always blamed the same person. The jester didn't just tell jokes, he carried their weight. And those weights weren't always funny. Some days, he didn't feel like a fool at all. He felt like a mouthpiece for a court that wanted to stay clean by hiding its dirt in a laugh. Part 45. He couldn't afford to be boring. Everyone else in the court could have bad days. A knight could sulk. A cook could be quiet. A noble could be distant. But the jester? He had to be on, every moment. Every hour. Every day. If he wasn't funny, he was useless. He couldn't be thoughtful. He couldn't be slow. He couldn't repeat old material or take a night to rest. The court had endless appetite for amusement, and the jester had to feed it constantly with new antics, new voices, new tricks. And if he ever failed, if the laughter didn't come fast enough or loud enough, he wasn't simply ignored. He was criticized, mocked, punished. A boring jester was a broken jester. And broken things didn't last long in royal courts. So he fought exhaustion with a painted grin, dug deep for energy he didn't have, performed with a pounding head and aching limbs. Because fading into the background wasn't an option. He wasn't allowed to be quiet, tired, or ordinary. He had to be unforgettable, or he'd be forgotten. Part 46. He had to laugh at injustice he witnessed. The jester saw everything in the court: who was favored, who was punished, who was betrayed, and who suffered in silence. He watched the innocent fall out of favor, the greedy rise in power, and the cruel be rewarded. And through it all, he had to smile. Sometimes he was present when a servant was struck unfairly, when a noble's cruelty went unchecked, or when a decision ruined lives far outside the castle walls. But he couldn't frown, couldn't gasp, couldn't object. Instead, he was expected to turn tragedy into farce, to cushion cruelty with comedy, to lighten moments that should have been heavy. His laughter, his presence, was used to cover up the rot. It hollowed him, because the jester wasn't blind. He knew what was right. He felt the unfairness like anyone would. But the moment he let it show, the moment he turned serious, the illusion would break, and so might he. So he learned the cruelest joke of all. Sometimes, in the court, laughter wasn't a joy, it was a weapon, and he was the one forced to wield it. Part 47. He was always at risk of being replaced by something less human. For all his years of service, for every clever rhyme, daring tumble, and perfectly timed jest, the jester always knew he could be replaced in an instant. Not by another man, but by something far less human. A monkey trained to dance. A bear that clapped to music. A puppet show run by mute servants. A parrot taught a few vulgar phrases. The court's thirst for novelty never stopped. And if the jester grew old, too familiar, or simply uninteresting, they might find more amusement in an animal wearing a tiny cap than in the man who had spent decades perfecting his craft. And the worst part? The court wouldn't mourn the change. They would laugh, perhaps louder than before, not because the new act was better, but because it was different. In that moment, the jester would finally understand what he'd always suspected. He wasn't valued for his soul, his wit, or his years. He was only ever valued for the sound he could make. And when someone, or something, made that sound better, he would simply disappear. Part 48. Even the children laughed at him, not with him. Children in the castle grew up watching the jester, bright colors, funny voices, silly dances. To them, he was entertainment before he was a person. And from a young age, they were taught to laugh at him, not with him. They mimicked his limp, pulled at his sleeves, threw crumbs at his feet. Some tried to trip him, just to see if he'd make a funny sound. To them, he wasn't an adult. He wasn't someone deserving of respect. He was a toy that walked and talked. And if he ever frowned, or gently corrected them, he was scolded. Don't ruin their fun, the nobles would say. They're just children. So he played along. He bowed when mocked. He smiled at their cruelty. He became the lesson no one meant to teach, that some people exist only to amuse others. Even when the jester had grown old, those children, now lords and ladies, still saw him the same way. They never learned to see the man beneath the hat, because no one had ever shown them how. Part 49. He was the only one who could never be offended. In the medieval court, everyone else was protected by pride, position, or power. A knight could bristle at a joke. A noble could storm out over a misplaced comment. A bishop could demand silence for the sake of piety. But the jester? He wasn't allowed to be offended, ever. People poked his belly, insulted his clothes, mocked his voice, and laughed at his pain. And he had to smile. Every time. If he flinched or frowned, they'd say, "What? The fool can't take a joke?" If he looked hurt, it ruined the mood. If he ever responded in kind, it was seen as insubordination. So he built walls behind his grin. Thick ones, quiet ones. He became a master of swallowing shame, laughing off humiliation, and pretending that every cruel jab was part of the game. Because to show any real emotion was to break the rules of the role. He was expected to absorb the worst and turn it into something amusing. And when the jester's heart cracked behind the mask, no one ever noticed. Part 50. And when he was gone, the silence was brief. One day, the jester was no longer there. No bells echoed in the corridor. No clumsy feet shuffled across the flagstones. No laughter rose during supper from the far end of the hall. The space he once filled, bright and ridiculous, felt momentarily quiet. A servant might have noticed first. A noble might have remarked, "Where's the fool?" The king might have raised a brow. But no one searched. No one sent word. No one lit a candle in his memory. And soon, someone else arrived. A newer jester. Louder. Younger. Perhaps with a painted face and livelier tricks. The court laughed again, just as it always had. The old jester's name was never spoken. His stories were told by someone else. His spot near the fire was taken. But in some faraway village, perhaps near the edge of a forest, an old man once told a tale that made children giggle. No one knew where he came from, or why his eyes seemed both kind and tired. And when he passed, there was no monument, just a brief stillness. And then, the world moved on.